Bogdan, Sikora, Accessibility and Modern Engineering. AliCamp. Gold sponsors ANZ, Intopia and Telstra. Silver sponsors Canva and Coles. Supporters Rumour, the design recruiter.
Thank you, Sarah, for introducing me. As was said. Oh yeah, okay. Thank you. So thank you for having me here in AliCamp, and I'm glad that you came here for my little session. And I'll be talking today about accessibility and modern engineering and what it means to be a developer in this. But firstly, let me introduce myself. My name is Bogdan Sikora. I am a CTO and co-founder of AccessTime, accessibility first software house that is based in Czech Republic and Indonesia. I spent over 12 years actually working as a software engineer and a QA, building websites, applications, and actually games as well, before I fully focused on digital accessibility. So let me start my talk with this statement. So telling developers to use semantic HTML is necessary, but is it always sufficient? So what does it actually mean to be a developer in 2025 with AI and everything? What do we as a developers need to do? And I'm talking here mainly from perspective of a small to medium companies. Of course, if you have like a massive corporations with thousands of engineers, it's going to be slightly different. But for a common developer out there in the market, what he needs to do to get a job. So first of all, he needs to be a full stack capable. What does that mean? He needs to be able to create, let's say right now we're talking mainly from like a web developer. So he needs to be full stack capable. He needs to be able to create the client side of the application, the thing that you can see and interact with, as well as the back of the magic that happens behind how the data are actually served to the client, how generally everything works in the background. You need to be able to work with AI. And I'm not talking here about your magic friend that kind of codes for you. I'm talking here being able to create AI-powered applications and being able to interact with the API and know how it works. Because after all applications right now are powered by AI, even though they don't need to. They need to know at least the basics of data engineering, because when they do store a data, they need to know how to store it properly and being retrieved in optimal time. They, of course, need to know how to store it securely, because data tend to be sensitive, and therefore they need to know how to properly make it secure. And of course, because of the expectations of AI coding and everything around it, they need to ship even faster than they ever did. And that makes it problematic. So what we do as a front-end engineers to make it faster, we use modern frameworks like React, Angular, Vue.js, and reusable components. So instead of us building every single page, every single component, every single small part from scratch, we already use it pre-built. In practice, that means that a lot of developers out there don't even touch HTML nor interact with it. It's all done for them. Rather than them handwriting every single div and button, they just use ready-made components that fits their needs, and they just configure them. Just for the non-technical people out there, what let's say a component library means, imagine reusable component libraries like IKEA catalog. When I want to build a wardrobe, I don't need to know anything about woodworking. Instead of milling wood and forging hinges, I get the ready-made parts. In web development, that would be buttons, inputs, forms, dialogues, and so on. And they already fit together and use the same screws, in this case, APIs and properties. And they use the same measurements as design tokens. This is just, you don't necessarily need to understand the code. I don't expect you to. I just want to kind of like showcase what it actually means in the practice. So we have two examples of a code. It's kind of like cut up a little bit, so it's actually able to read. And for those who want to kind of get the full code of it, there is provided links to ARIA Patterns website where the left part is from, and to HTML, that's the library, component library used for the right side to actually get the full code if you want to play around with it and read the full extent of it. So on the left, we can see how an HTML ComboBox should look like and what kind of properties it should have to be considered accessible. You can see that, let's say, it's around 20 to 30 lines of code, maybe more than 20. However, for it to fully work, it actually requires around 500 additional lines of JavaScript for it to actually behave the way it is expected to behave. On the other side, if I, as a front-end engineer, use a React, that's the example on the right, and one of the popular component libraries, like HTML, I can get the same behavior in around 20 lines of code. And it will behave the same way, and in this case, it will be as well mostly accessible. Of course, depends on the actual implementation, but this will be considered accessible. And you can see like why would developers choose to use the smaller part, because it is faster. And it's actually a good thing that developers do choose the easy way. Because when well used, component libraries are a very big win for accessibility. Because solid library gives you accessibility out of the box. It handles everything for you. It handles keyboard navigation, it handles focus, it handles how it's expected for it to behave. Of course, if well used. And developers don't have to wire all of that stuff from scratch, and potentially, of course, makes mistakes. And it just works, and accessible patterns just ship by default. And sometimes without the developers even knowing or noticing. Here's just like example of few like trendy ones when it comes to React. And we can see like the trendy one that currently like are hyping is HTML and Redux UI alongside with headless UI. Or we have more like established players like Material UI, Chakra UI, or InDesign. However, there is over 79,000 more libraries out there. And they either build on top of the existing solutions and just adding their custom things on top of it, or even people making their own for themselves, or within bigger companies, it tends to be like a small team that actually creates all of it and the rest of the company actually using it. And let me show you an example of a disconnect when it comes to an accessibility guidance of such a teams. So in Access Time, we mostly do focus on creating like accessible solutions. But as we are creating it, we of course need to be able to test it and being able to verify that we did a good job. And therefore, sometimes what we do for clients is a general consultation and audit of their solutions. And this is a story from like early days of Access Time that we were working on such an audit for a client. And I was personally like performing that. And we just basically went through the audit, the usual circle. We localized some issues. And one of those issues was that there was an accessibility issue with their toast navigation. I reported it properly. I provided certain solutions how they can fix it. You can find different examples of how HTML, what tags it should have, how it should behave. I gave them even like 3 different solutions how they could fix it. And I was proud of myself. You know, I did a good job. I sent it off to a client. And the response I got was, but we are using those library X that handles everything for us. We don't know if that library supports accessibility or not. And you probably, if you are consulting and doing audits, you might have heard something similar to that. And for me as a developer, I was like, yeah, of course. I personally very rarely actually do this stuff from scratch. I will use as well library like that to perform that action for me. I would not wire it from scratch. So what was the outcome of my advice that I was so proud of? My advice was probably just ignored because it was just too impractical. It wasn't applicable to their tech stack and how they're doing stuff. And the developer potential takeaway was that it's just accessibility is too hard and maybe not even worth it. The problem with my advice was that I gave them from scratch HTML guidance that didn't map to their component library. My fixes assumed that they do all of it by themselves or have the full control of the DOM or the HTML. However, they had access only to the library API. I shared resources, not in stack action, that were very high effort for them to actually implement. And it looked more like a refactor, not a tweak. So it felt risky to defer. Because my advice basically told them, yeah, you're doing it wrong, just throw it all away and redo it. So what did they actually need from me? They needed a specific guidance to what they do. If they're using certain library, I could have provided them a documentation to the particular library. Maybe there is a specific documentation how they handle accessibility and what they're supposed to do. If I have access to that information that they use certain libraries, I could have provided them straight away a simple fix or a tiny wrapper how to fix it, because generally the libraries are similar to each other, and therefore I could have provided them a simple fix that one line of code or one property to set could have fixed all of it for them. And of course, as a lot of those libraries can be custom made or made by people that don't, let's say, understand accessibility, they could not have the support to actually be accessible. And therefore, I could have provided them a better solution or better supported library with if applicable, with a clear migration criteria. So what I want to mainly highlight in this talk is we need to meet developers where they are. If they're coding in React or different frameworks or libraries, they're not going to drop it just to actually fix small fix. We need to meet them in whatever environment and way they're coding, so it's easier for them to implement and generally adopt. So what should we do, and how do we bridge that gap between our advice, let's say as accessibility practitioners, and we tell them, hey, this is the HTML code, this is the different properties that you're supposed to use, and what they actually seeing in day-to-day lives. So as accessibility practitioners, maybe must is slightly too strong, more like should, we should understand how developers actually make applications today, what tools they are using. If they're using, let's say, React Native to build a native applications, you cannot advise them in native code how they should fix it. You're going to advise them in React Native. And the same comes for the web. If they are creating an applications in React and different libraries, you should advise them within those patterns. You should learn popular libraries and frameworks. You don't necessarily need to be able to code in them. You can leave that to the developers. But you should understand how they work, how they handle accessibility, where they come short, and where they benefit people. And with that knowledge, you can easily advise them, even without actually looking at their product. You might actually know what the issue is going to be, and therefore you can anticipate them, and you can straight away be able to look for them. Yeah, as I said, you need to understand how they handle the accessibility, because some of them are notorious for just not caring at all. Some of them handle it very well. And therefore, you can advise even to change or improve. And you should definitely advocate within modern frameworks and libraries for better accessible defaults and documentations. Because the developers will use the component libraries, because it's easier. It's faster and simpler to maintain and develop. And therefore, we need to advocate to those developers of those reusable libraries to actually provide an accessibility and provide a good way to actually create an accessible solutions with those libraries. Because when we do this, we make it easier to implement accessibility. We reduce enormously their learning curve. Because when a general developer that never even heard about accessibility is now creating an accessible solutions, it's a win for everyone. And accessibility implementation generally becomes faster because we don't need to know or exactly have knowledge of all that different behavior that it should do, and we can still ship accessible code very fast. And when we advocate within the modern frameworks, we encourage the libraries to become more accessible, leading to general broader adoption of accessibility. If we want to implement an accessibility today, it must align and adapt to modern development practices. And this, what I want to highlight the most is kind of like a follow-up to Joe's stuff. When you do, let's say, code with an AI agent as a developer, you don't necessarily do code an HTML page with HTML. Even the AI agent will suggest to me, let's say, ShedCN most of the times right now, because it's the most popular and everyone uses it. So it will suggest that library, and my code will be used with that library. Therefore, we need to ensure that those libraries have a proper documentation about accessibility. So let's say the AI agents, as well as the humans making the solution, can read it and make appropriate choices. We need to make sure that those libraries, and we advising within those libraries, because there is a benefit to it, are actually having the proper settings and proper defaults to them, so majority of us can develop it very well. And that's it for me. Thank you for listening.
AliCamp, celebrating 10 years.